Well, hey guys, we are excited about the content for today. We're going to be looking at something I think that's near and dear to most of our hearts, especially after a busy week or weekend, which I think most of us have experienced. If you're watching this perhaps in real time, you know we just came out of Easter weekend, in which in the church world is a big thing. So we're going to talk about rest in ministry. And if you think through kind of the aspect of rest, obviously it's necessary, but I want to kind of anchor it in a verse that I think many of us would know. Mark chapter 6, verse 31, and it says, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. Doesn't that sound good? Like, why don't you just come over here, hang out, and rest a while? And so when we think about ministry, it's not it is unique in this aspect that the work that we do is very meaningful because it has eternal impact. There's always a need. There's a consistency of need for ministry, and the opportunities to serve at wherever you serve and however you serve, they never ever end. So the tension comes in to where if we're not intentional, rest is usually, for most ministry leaders and pastors, the first thing to go. I've got too many things to do, so rest has to go out the window. And so even in the scripture, the disciples were good at, work and doing important work, but yet Jesus still calls them and even calls us to rest. And so the thing we know about it, rest and ministry, if you have been around church for a while and kind of ministry for a while, we know that ministry, if you don't rest, the next thing for you is exhaustion. And that rest really isn't a reward for finishing a ton of work. It's really more rooted in this idea of rhythm, which we're going to be kind of getting into. And so I've got a great panel here. I think you're going to know probably some of them, but I want to take a moment and let our panel introduce themselves. And we're going to be introducing some topics and covering a lot of things. And I know that everyone on this call is going to be bringing a lot of wisdom. And so I want to throw it over to Daniel to start the introductions, and then we'll jump into our content.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Williams. I pastor here in Southeast Florida, Calvary Chapel, the Palm Beaches. Always excited to be hosting and a part of this discussion and conversation, especially with good friends from pastors around the world.
Hey, I'm Jared. I'm serving in Northern California at Open Gate Christian Fellowship and been here for almost 7 years. And we've got 5 kids, and my wife and I are blessed to be here and thankful for all that the Lord's doing.
I'm Kaká. I'm from Brazil, south of Brazil, Curitiba, and we're just launching the church next week. And I'm married, have 3 kids, and I'm really pumped to be here. What I'm really honored to hang out and talk about something so important that is about resting in ministry. So that's going to be fun.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for being here. And as you can tell, if you're watching and are listening to this, we've got a wealth of information. A lot of people in different seasons of whether they're planting or planting again, or just even in church or have busyness in family. And so hopefully this resonates with many of us. But we've got to kind of start really with this idea that if rest is essential, there's kind of a question I think that goes with it. And we have to ask, why is it so hard for us to actually practice it? I mean, if it's essential to life and ministry, why is it so hard for us to practice it? And so, kind of thinking about pastors and leaders, why do pastors and leaders struggle to rest? And I think for many of us, we feel like, well, the mission feels very urgent, which it is. I mean, we're changing the world, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, where, the lives are being changed, people have needs. There's always something more to do, but underneath, there's this little danger. And sometimes our identity can be tied to productivity. Guilt can set in when we feel like we're slowing down, or we may take a day off. We might feel even guilty, or we may even feel like we're falling behind. I know that never has happened to any of us, right? We feel like we're falling behind. And so I want to kick a question off, and I want Jared, you're going to get the first one here, and the crew here will jump in to kind of throw in just, I think, a wealth of information here. But I want to ask, Jared, what makes it hardest, maybe for you personally, to rest in busy seasons of ministry?
Couple things come to mind. You mentioned some of them already, but guilt, just feeling like I'm going to let people down. And sometimes the person I'm letting down is myself, because I have a higher expectation of productivity that I really want to accomplish. I just want things to be better. Like, I kind of have the personality that there's always more to do. And even when my message is done for Sunday, I can make it better. I can keep going. And I just have to let go of that and say, okay, Lord, here's what I've got. It's got to be you, because I'm just bringing the loaves and fishes today. So yeah, I struggle with guilt. I struggle with letting people down, letting myself down. I struggle with control. I struggle with pride because sometimes I feel like it's maybe easier to just do it myself than to train somebody else to do it, and or it'll go smoother if I do this one little thing as opposed to let somebody else do that and give myself a chance to break and rest. So those are the first things that come to mind.
Yeah, I often have to tell our congregation this, and it's more of a reminder to me. You are not God. And I think sometimes we never want to say that. Like, we want to say Jesus is our Savior and Lord, but when we actually have to trust Him with everything, it really is hard to take rest because we have to play the position of we are not God. We are not in control. That's why I think the Sabbath is so good. It's a weekly rhythm to say, hey, I have a capacity, I have a limit. I am not infinite, I am finite, and I can't do everything. And so I know one of the resistance or temptations for us to be is because we're leaders and people are always looking to us. We get sort of a God complex thinking that we can do it all and we should know all and be all, but that's God's role, not us. And that's why it's so important to practice rest and a great temptation for us not to practice rest.
Good.
Yeah, I agree with what was said. The thing is very normal, unfortunately, to think that things will not go well without us. And they were so important that people need us so badly, And one of the things that I realized that to trust the Lord, that we are not the most important, and things gonna go well without us. Even like if it is for a day, and if it is for weeks or like even months, right? So like I've been on a sabbatical for 3 months last year, and I was afraid, I was concerned. I'll be really honest here, that I'll get back home and everything was just great and amazing, and it was just like the church they don't need me, you know. And that was exactly what happened. I got back, everybody was like, the church is doing great, you know. So it kind of like it kind of hurts a little, of our pride. But I think the hardest thing for me it is to think that something that I don't know. I don't know if it's a Calvary Chapel thing, but people from back in the day, I was used to hear that we're gonna rest in heaven forever, you know. And every time I'm kind of resting, I'm thinking like I'm not in heaven, It's like in my cushions, like a voice, something, you know. So yeah, it took me a long time to kind of break out from this voice, Just like, yeah, it's true. We're gonna rest in heaven forever, but we're gonna work there too somehow, you know. But anyways, yeah,
Yeah, I think that's great, man. And I appreciate you sharing that perspective, Kaka. Just having that sabbatical. And you're right. I think we would all like to say, "Oh, I would love to take, however many months off and take some time away." But I think the real fear for many of us, and I'd probably put myself in that same camp, is that, well, I'm not going to be needed. I'm not going to, we feel like rest is when we rest, we're not being productive, and so our identity comes into play there. And I want to kind of toy around with this one question here and kind of think through it a little bit and maybe throw it back out to you guys and see what you think. And maybe Daniel, we'll start with you. But I want to talk about like there's calling, right? And then there's capacity. And while true, the Lord can call you and you're, an expression of the mission that you're accomplishing for the Lord, but then your capacity is really what allows you to fulfill that. And whatever capacity, the speed and everything goes with it. And for instance, I could come in and feel called to, in my area, St. Augustine, but the calling that the Lord has for me and the capacity is giving me may be different than another church planter and someone else. And so I want to kind of wrestle through, because I think sometimes it's easy for us to look at all the churches on Instagram, this, that, and the other, and we think everyone is doing great. They're always doing 5 more things than we are, and whatever. We can kind of wrestle with that. But I want to just take a moment to wrestle with calling and capacity, and I want to see what wisdom Daniel can drop on us with regards to that, and maybe rest.
Well, when I think of calling capacity, I think of self-awareness. You got to be wise as a leader to know what God has called you to do, and then how to actually implement that. 1 Corinthians talks about each one has a measure of grace or a capacity. And so I may have a capacity to do 50 hours a week or 70 hours or 30 hours a week. I may have a different capacity than someone else. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul says it's unwise to compare one another, our capacity to one another, because we're all under God's authority. He's the head of the church, and he's called us to do different roles, different members. We think about this literally when we talk about the church and the mouthpiece and the liver, but we don't often think about different churches in the community having a different role. Some are more evangelistic, some are more class driven, those certain things based off of the gifts and the grace that God's given us. And the beautiful thing about capacity and calling is when you understand the grace of God in your life, you're able to operate based off of favor and joy and worship and not guilt, not shame, because God hasn't called you to do all this other stuff. I learned a long time ago, you got to say no to a lot of good things so you can say yes to a God thing. And so really understanding who you are in God, in Christ, what grace and gifts he's given you will actually help you know your capacity to say no to the 17 other things that are really good, but God hasn't called you to do that because he knows your capacity. And even in your weakness, he'll use you because he'll be strong in that. So I just sort of think about those things when I think about, man, grace, comparison, what to do, how to do it. We can really overdo it quickly when we don't understand the capacity and the grace God's given us.
That's good. Good. Jared, Kakai, any thoughts there?
I was just
Yeah.
I was just reminded, I think the whole idea of capacity, I think as Daniel said, the thing about be aware of, it doesn't come too obvious. It's like we need self-awareness, and a lot of times when we realize we went beyond that we should. So I think it's really important that we know ourselves. And I think, I don't know about you guys, normally my wife, she does a really great job on that. She's always like caring for, because she's more quiet and introvert. She's kind of, she mastered it. She's like, hey, if we're gonna go tomorrow and gonna spend the whole day with people, like we cannot do this today. You know, we're gonna just like save it for tomorrow, or like, we're gonna do it tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we're gonna rest. And for me, it was just like just a few weeks ago, I was in South Florida, and I thought I'm gonna be there for a week. Won't be a big deal. I'm gonna do things that I love, and I'm gonna hang out with friends. And I had something really important coming up just a few days later, and it was something I was like waiting for many years to be part of, like kind of. It was not a conference, but it was a training for catalyzers from city to city. And I was like, I'm gonna spend a week in South Florida. I'm gonna come spend some days with the family. I'm gonna jump on the bus on a Monday. I will be there. And when I got home, some friends they say, "Dude, you look very tired." And my wife's like, "I don't think you should go." And I was like, "All right, I'm not going." It's something really awesome, but I'm not going. So, but I realized that my capacity was already over. And I had to kind of rebuild on that. So I think self-awareness is something that we need to be trained. Otherwise, like, we're gonna think that we still have a lot, but we don't. So that's when it crash.
No, that's good. I remember a mentor of mine, Crawford Loritz, had a statement in one of his books, and it talks about leadership as an identity, was the name of the book. But he talked about like that capacity and calling and all that stuff. And he would often just remind us that, the Lord will remind you of your capacity, sometimes in a very memorable way. And so it's good for us to kind of pay attention to the capacity and kind of what we're doing. So I want to kind of talk to you. So we talked again about, rest and things like that. And most of us, I think, would say and think that if I do rest, then I don't get to do items A, B, and C, if you're like a list keeper or whatever, right? But there's also a cost I want us to kind of think through of not resting, that there comes a cost, like when we choose not to rest and continue to push through and continue to do, go. When we skip that, we think it's making us more effective, but actually there's a cost. And I want to kind of maybe throw this idea out there, but I would say without rest, clarity begins to fade. Patience with others, maybe our family, shortens. Joy begins to diminish. People become problems instead of the purpose of what we were called to do. And I think all of us have experienced this some level. And in the most dangerous aspect, we begin doing spiritual work, which is eternal, but without being spiritually healthy. And so I want to throw a question out there, and we'll throw this, Kaka. We'll get you going on this one here. But maybe, and I think it'd be good from your perspective because you've gone through a season of sabbatical. You've planted sabbatical. Now you're about to start planting again.
Mhm.
What are the early, at least in your perspective, early warning signs of maybe burnout or you really needing to have that rest? What have you seen in your own life?
Yeah, I've been like in different places, in different positions when it comes to that. But I remember one time that was very crucial for me. I love to be around people, you know? That's how I get energized. Like I love being by myself with books and coffee, but if I can choose, I would be around people hanging out, eating good food, you know? And one day I woke up and I was like, I don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to see anyone, you know? And I realized I was like, that's not me at all, you know? So that's when I looked for help. And then I was talking to Lillian, my wife, and she was like, looks like you've been like that for a little while, you know? And I just thought how far you'd go on that. And so I looked for help and I started, doing some homework or the things that need to change. But I remember, like, for a guy who loved to be around people, and I remember that was a key moment. Actually, like there were 2 days on that, but there was one I was hanging out somewhere and I love coffee shops. And there was this really nice coffee shop and I decided not to go to stay alone in my room. And then I was like, I'm gonna call Lily, I'm gonna talk to her, you know. And then after that, there was what I said, I was at home and I woke up and I didn't want to see anyone. So for me, it is a sign, as you mentioned, Billy, the losing patient kind of thing. For me, it is to not want to be with people, and for me, it's also the thing with kids. So when the kids like seem fired up all the time, even though they are not, it is a sign. So normally, like I know that when I realize, I'll go and talk to Lynn and say, "Hey, the thing I'm running out of patience." She's like, "Yeah, you are." You know. So yeah, that's
Mm.
two big signs for me.
So you're saying your wife is a sounding board. I like
She
that.
is. She
That's
is.
good.
Yeah. And she does it really well, very graciously, you know.
Yeah, I can testify to the importance of a godly wife who can, without my wife, I'd have crashed and burned a dozen times already, just because I have very poor self awareness and she can help me realize where I'm at before I realize it. Because you were talking about, your relationship with your kids and your family, that starts to go, it starts to change. You can't enjoy the things that normally you do enjoy. That's a big sign for me too in worship. When I can't worship because my brain's just so full of like tasks or things I'm trying to get done, that's a big warning sign for me. I think of Colossians 3:15 talks about let the peace of God rule in your hearts, and losing that peace of God where you're just working, like you're just chugging, but there's no peace because it's not spiritual, it's fleshly. And yeah, those are all things I can relate to.
But how would you recognize when your soul, not just your schedule, is tired? How do you recognize that? And just in what you've seen in ministry, maybe yourself and others,
Personally for me or principle for everyone?
both.
Like what? Okay. The thing that comes to mind is he refreshes others, is himself refreshed. There's that proverb that says when you give out and pour out, you actually receive something like a blessing. And I find myself that when I'm pouring out and I'm not finding joy in it, the motivation in something is wrong. I'm doing it for a different motivation or reason. I'm doing it because of the list or the law that I have set up, that if I do a whole bunch of good things, it's going to appease God, make God happy, do something. And that is a key sign for me. If I can serve and that I find joy in that and it's worship unto me, then I'm myself being refreshed. So um, that sort of comes to mind personally for me. But when I've seen like in a general principle rule of like how I've seen people lose sight of things, I think that Colossians 3:15 verse that Jared mentioned is very key. I find when people are striving or stressed and doing it out of a place of guilt or have to rather than want to, that's a very key indicator for a lot of people. Because I think we all went into ministry because we wanted to. We were all responding to Jesus, and it was an overflow of our hearts. And so when it doesn't become a response of, wow, this is amazing because Jesus is amazing, we actually start becoming like Martha and worrying and tripping and doing a whole bunch of stuff because we're thinking that doing the stuff is worship rather than Jesus, you're awesome. I'm doing it because of you. So I sort of noticed personally in my own self that principle, but I've seen so many people start well out of response and love for the Lord, and then they just forget they're actually doing it and why they're doing it. And I think that's something very critical for our soul to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, I think I like the way you stated that, the list and laws. I think that we can kind of just build in our own heads over time. I've got this list, I got to go do it. And I've got my own set of rules. And this is just what I do. And when I do it, and this is how it goes. And we can get kind of trapped in that. So no, that was very good. I appreciate you sharing that. And when you think about, again, the cost of not resting, so then it leads to this idea, well, how, what does it look like to build rest in your life? And again, I think the beauty of being in groups with other leaders and pastors is that you get to learn from one another. And there's not just one particular way. I know for me, I like to ride a bike. That's my thing. And, if I want to go out on a Friday and ride on the beach, or just maybe go out on Saturday, like for me, it's just a way to kind of just have time to yourself and kind of rhythms of rest, or taking that day off, their Sabbath day, and what that looks like. But what we do know is that however you decide to rest doesn't happen accidentally. You don't just roll out of bed and it's like, oh, I think I'm just going to rest today. You got to plan for it. And healthy leaders and ministry leaders and pastors, what I've seen is they tend to build their lives with intentionality. And I'm not saying you got to have like everything scheduled by the minute, but I would say you need to be intentional, certainly, about rest. And so whether that's boundaries around certain times, availability, like I know Daniel, I know when I could shoot him a message on certain days, and I know that he's not going to get back with me. Why? Because I know like that's his Sabbath day. Like he has set boundaries. And I think setting margins and schedules and trusting that God is going to work, even though when we're not, those are all things that are part of rest. And so really it makes rest for us is really ultimately coming down to an act of trust. Do we trust the Lord who called us to something, to still work and move the things that need to be moved, and to grow us even when we are resting? And so I just going to throw just a question out there, and anyone can feel free to jump in, but I would love to kind of hear what seems to be working for you, so that those who are watching this can say, man, maybe I'll give that a try. But what rhythms of rest have been most life-giving to you? And I'll start with Kaka. Let's start with you, Kaka. What's been working for you?
I think getting prepared like ahead, knowing that a busy season is coming, and just taking advantage of time to enjoy like quiet time, whatever, like, going to different places that I like and hanging out with the family. I love to hang out with Lillian a lot. So whenever when the kids go to school, I'll say, hey, like the next days and week's going to be pretty busy. Let's go and do stuff. I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy doing. So I know that, for example, I know Easter's coming. I knew some weeks before that we could enjoy some great time together and do the things that we like. One of the things that I'm used to say that in the Norwegians, they know how to rest well. You know, they learn like in school how they rest. They go up in the mountains. They go to the fjords. They go out fishing, and that's how that's how they do life. Day off, let's do something like that. Let's go ski. And Brazilians are not like that. Brazilians go to bed late and they wake up very late, and they think that that's very restful. You know, and now they wake up like worse than they would than the night before. So I think that's has been a cool thing, like getting ready and prepared for the busy like seasons and times and weeks, and enjoy without feeling guilty, without feeling weird about it. And when people call in those times, normally I would ask if it is very like urgent, and most of the time are not. I say you can call me tomorrow. That's fine.
That's good.
Yeah. So for me, I have my phone automatically go on Do Not Disturb at 5 o'clock every evening so that I can focus on my family. And if somebody really needs to get a hold of me, they call a couple of times and get through, I can ask them, hey, can I call you tomorrow? Because chances are it's not really the emergency that it feels like. But also, Fridays is our family day. I'm off my phone. No texts, no email, nothing. And I confess that's really hard sometimes. Sometimes I just feel it in my bones, and I'm like, I give my phone to my wife. I'm like, hey, can you just check, make sure there's actually nothing urgent, and help me deal with my craziness? And she will. But that's been so life-giving to me. And especially to hear her say, no, there's nothing. And I'm like, really? Great, and just calming down. But I need those scheduled into my weeks because it won't happen if I don't schedule it. So those have been really helpful for me, those practices, even though I still struggle with them and I don't feel like I'm that great at resting. Those have been the most life-giving to me.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Good.
for me, the most life-giving thing has been Sabbath. I mean, 24 days to stop work, to rest, to delight in God's grace, and to contemplate and worship God. So, in the beginning of a church plant, in my email, I even said, sorry, I'm not going to reply. Mondays is my Sabbath. I'll get back to you on Tuesday. Like, that was the tag. Training people, being intentional about it, not checking my phone, doing things that replenish you. So even that self-awareness to know, you know what? I really like working out extra, going on like long bike rides or watching movies or cutting my grass or whatever it may be to replenish me. In fact, after Easter yesterday, I knew it was a big Easter weekend and busy. I read a whole book on my Sabbath day. It's just, hey, I'm going to take a couple extra hours and worship God in this way, and not just sleeping, not just stopping work, but what actually fills my cup. How can I enjoy God's grace in my life and worship Him? Oftentimes, I listen to many of my preaching friends that are all around the world on my Sabbath day and just get fed the Word of God or do something that replenishes my soul. And so that practice, that alone, has kept me throughout the years being bivocational, planning churches, pouring into leaders, doing all this different stuff, a rhythm that God gave us. And if you think about it, it's an extra 52 days of holiday a year that we get, just being able to have nothing on our schedule and just enjoy God's grace. Beautiful thing.
Oh, that's so good. I like the way you frame that. The 52 extra days off that you get a year that you're probably missing. So certainly find
That's right.
something. And I think
That's right.
to kind of land all this together and bring it all together, the reality is that you can't really lead effectively if your own soul is running on empty.
Yep.
And while we can go stand on and say, we're climbing the mountain of faithfulness, you can't climb the mountain of faithfulness if you're always exhausted.
Yep.
And healthy ministry, which I think many of us want to be a part of, that's a legacy we want to leave, flows from a healthy soul. So it's imperative, it's important for us to be able to do that. And so I would say if you're listening, you're watching, and you're realizing, man, there's some things that, we talked about today. We talked about why rest is hard for ministry leaders. We talked about what it costs when we ignore. There is a cost. And then we talked a little bit about maybe just some of the ways to kind of build rhythms that sustain you. And it can look a little bit differently for all of us. But the idea is to kind of stay, engaged in ministry and your calling and be faithful for the long haul. And so I would say a couple action steps for those who are watching this would think about, schedule rest before your week fills up. Schedule that time and block it off. What I typically do, and I've shared this before, even in this cohort that we're in, is I'll block off time and I'll put it for 8 hours and I'll just call it something. So that when somebody says, "Hey, can we meet?" It's like, no, I got something on my calendar. I personally like doing that because then I feel like I'm not lying to them. I'm telling them, hey, I do have something on there. But maybe for others, maybe it's setting one boundary that you just need to reinforce. I think setting the phone down, putting that away, shutting it off, that's a great thing. Maybe somebody needs to do that. But I think for all of us, we can look for ways to be intentional about finding that moment with God. Like Daniel said, he read a book, and for others, we might just engage in the beauty of nature and just worship him, just read his word, whatever that is. But the idea is that in ministry, we don't have to carry everything because guess what? We weren't meant to. And so rest is imperative. It's important. So just appreciate you guys tuning in to this one, and hopefully that this ministers to you and it keeps you in ministry for a long, long time. I want to thank our panel again for just the wisdom that you gave us today. And we just pray that the Lord would just bless your time as you kind of discover or rediscover rest in the natural flow of your ministry.